Hello, and welcome to another episode of our webinar for the spring of 2023 for the Center for Environmental Policy at American University's School of Public Affairs. My name is Todd Eisenstadt. It's a pleasure to welcome you to a sectoral approach to climate mitigation. Today, we are looking at issues of buildings and transportation. We have, as we have in the past few webinars, we have experts with us from Energy Innovation. Those are Sarah Baldwin, the Senior Director of Electrification Policy, and Chris Bush, the Director of Transportation and Senior Economist. We also are very, very fortunate to have with us David Levy, who's the Director of Planning and Zoning for the town of Vienna, Virginia. And we will be turning the floor over to Sarah and Chris, who will speak for a period of time. Then we'll have David as a discussant. And then if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will get to some of those at the end. So now I'd like to turn the table over to Sarah, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. And it is a pleasure to be with you all here today. Let me go ahead and get my screen up. And does that look good on your end?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to dive right in because we do have a lot to cover, and I want to really get to the core of our content today. Before I do, just a little bit about Energy Innovation, Policy and Technology. We are a nonpartisan energy and climate policy think tank, and we are collectively working towards a climate-safe future where people and the planet thrive. Our work is really based on the scientific assessments of climate change, and this week in particular, we have yet another urgent call from the IPCC and the UN saying we have a very limited amount of time to tackle this challenge. So we prioritize the policies and work in the largest emitting nations and sectors. I'll talk a little bit about that as I dive into this today, but we really try to accelerate carbon neutral solutions at the speed and the scale necessary to really tackle climate. And of course, we want to emphasize and optimize economic security and equity benefits. And our work is grounded in data. It's driven by an open source, peer-reviewed energy policy simulator model, as well as a climate policy book, Designing Climate Solutions, all of which is on our website for folks. So today's agenda on the building sector, and Chris will touch on the transportation. I'm going to do a quick run through of the building sector's contribution to climate with a focus on the US, sources of emissions, the technologies and the measures that we know work to decarbonize buildings, a combination of influencing factors and barriers that impact getting things done, and then the policy solutions. So, snapshot of the world as far as emissions go. This is a MECO chart put together by our colleagues, and it is showing a breakdown of the different countries that are the largest emitting countries in the world, with, of course, China in the lead, US behind China, and then India, Russia, so on and so forth. The width of each segment of this chart demonstrates the overall contribution of each economies to the greenhouse gas emissions profile. And then the different segments within each of the stacks here show where those emissions are coming from, with the top chunk being industry, the next chunk in yellow being electricity, the chunk thereafter being buildings, transportation, agriculture, and so forth. So I show this to demonstrate that we know we have a lot to do in really all these sectors. Industry and electricity, of course, are huge priorities in the world. And buildings are a relatively small piece overall. But in the US, we do have a bigger relative profile compared to some other countries. And regardless, buildings are important for a lot of reasons. Now, this is from the recent greenhouse gas inventory that the EPA puts out. This is their 2023 inventory, which is very exciting. And I put this here to show two things. The trend overall for our electricity sector, while we still have quite a bit to go, is generally down. We are reducing emissions quickly, more quickly than in other sectors, because we are playing out renewable energy standards, clean electricity, zero carbon policies across all states. And that's an exciting and very encouraging trend. Now, at the bottom, you have commercial and residential buildings, and they've maintained relatively flat over time. Part of that is due to just increasing efficiency. As we build more buildings, as we have new appliances, they generally trend more efficient. And we have a population surge generally in the world right now, but our population isn't overly exceeding standards and averages. So our buildings, of course, reflect that as well. But the reason this is important, these two pieces, is that we're going to talk about electrification. And electrification, we know, is a key strategy to decarbonize our economy, because we can actually remove fossil fuel combustion in buildings by connecting end uses to our increasingly clean electric grid. And we know this is something that we can do because we have the technologies to do it. Now, as far as a breakdown in the US of our building sector emissions, of course, we categorize them by direct and indirect. The direct being the actual combustion of fossil fuels in our homes for heating, appliances, and water heat. And the indirect emissions are what we attribute to the electricity consumption, lighting and heating that's already electric, appliances that are electric, and so on and so forth. And because this is a US average, this of course reflects the average grid emissions state by state, which I'll show in the next slide. It definitely differs. But we have a big chunk of direct emissions, primarily from natural gas for heat and for appliances like stoves and water heaters. And then there are a handful of scenarios and a smaller chunk where folks are burning propane or butane or heating oil for those direct emissions. So we have work to do in the building sector. And as I just said, depending on your state, depending on where you live or where you come from, different states, of course, have different emissions profiles across the board. The snapshot here is showing a recent analysis by our team looking at different state greenhouse gas emissions profiles. And I put this here just to illustrate that in, say, Minnesota or Michigan, the buildings piece of their overall emissions profile is pretty large, whereas in Louisiana and New Mexico, it's much smaller. So always important to keep in mind that this is not a uniform scenario in every state. And then a good important reminder is that we are really focused on climate. That's what drives our work, as I said, but buildings impact public health. And we know this. We know this from decades of research looking at different factors, everything from mold and lead paint to the combustion of fossil fuels inside being closely linked to asthma and other health impacts. And there are a number of documented building-related illnesses that have known causes and have a lot of connection with how we build our buildings, with what materials we build, and what kind of interior environment we create for people. So with that, the good news is that we do have technologies today and measures to decarbonize buildings. Shown here is the infamous heat pump you've probably hearing more and more about from folks, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But before I do, I just want to remind folks, we've all lived in different types of buildings. We've visited different types of buildings. We've seen the ugly technologies. We've seen the the condensation in the windows, or the very, very scary lead pipe, excuse me, not lead pipe, but gas pipe, distribution pipe. This one pictured here is actually one from my home before I removed my gas stove. And the gas technician actually told me, wow, this was kind of a ticking time bomb because it was just so old and unsafe. So we know that there are older technologies, and many of them do have kind of reminiscent challenges. And some people really feel strongly about technologies. You hear people talk about electric stoves of the old variety, the spiral variety, and it's like a visceral reaction, like, oh my gosh, I never want to cook with those. Rightly so, because they're pretty horrible to cook with. Compact fluorescent light bulbs, not the most beautiful things. So, the good news is we've actually evolved quite a lot. And I would argue we're in kind of a pretty amazing time because our technology learning curves are really speeding up. We have technologies for really all the appliances and equipment that we use in our homes and our buildings. And that is enabling us to quickly decarbonize not just our homes and buildings, but now we're able to decarbonize our vehicles by installing EV charging at home and having smart thermostats that allow us to monitor from our smartphones. So we have this amazing technological era we're in, and the technologies are definitely here to stay and only improve. And the heat pump pictured in the left here is what you hear most about because it tackles two of the biggest emitting segments of most homes for sure. And that is our heating and our cooling. So a heat pump actually works very similar to the technology that you have in your refrigerator, and it relies on the external air to via a refrigerant either cool or heat depending on the season and depending on the ambient temperature. And it's 3 to 4 times more energy efficient than a standard natural gas efficient furnace. So that's kind of the snapshot of the technologies, but I want to talk a little bit about the measures because not all things are created equal with respect to how we can decarbonize, but they all matter when you add them together. Conservation is, of course, first and foremost. However, it's not exactly the most reliable because it requires repeated behavior. It requires people paying attention. It requires people caring, which of course we always want to do, and we always want to have that component, but it's not something that folks, at least those in the building space, want to have to rely on in order to achieve savings or emissions reductions. Energy efficiency, on the other hand, is built in because it's using less energy to provide the same or better products, services, or amenities. So the minute you install more efficient lighting, you're automatically saving, as opposed to having to remember to turn the light off, which you still want to do. And it basically helps reduce overall demand. So, we're hearing more about the electricity grid and how important it is that we have a stable, reliable grid. And reducing demand is a very important strategy to do that. That's why utilities rely heavily on energy efficiency programs to achieve savings and to also reduce costs for consumers. Electrification, as I mentioned, is effectively switching either partially or fully from technologies that use fossil fuels, such as your natural gas furnace, to those that use and rely on electricity, such as a heat pump. And there are commercial segment equivalents. This electric boiler here shown in the middle, very sophisticated, fancy technology that has come on the market in the last several years. And there are a lot of other examples. Chris is going to talk more about electrification in the transportation sector. And then demand flexibility is what you may have heard of as sort of smart controls or smart meters or apps, all of which can use communication and controls to shift the electricity use across the hours of the day while delivering services at the same or better quality and lower cost. And demand flexibility is going to become increasingly important as we electrify more end uses, because we're going to need to manage load. We're going to need to manage load so we don't break the grid / achieve untenable peaks that cause huge cost burdens on consumers. So this is an important piece of the overall puzzle. And it seems like, how is this connected to buildings? But the reason is that this demand flexibility comes from our buildings. It comes from how we use our electricity and our energy in our homes, and it comes from different programs. And then finally, probably the most common technology that people equate with building decarbonization is distributed energy resources. So these are resources that are typically on-site renewable generation or energy storage. EVs are increasingly considered to be a potential distributed resource that we can call on, and any other grid interactive technologies that basically connect a building to its source of energy via these technologies. And distributed generation in particular is another factor impacting our load, impacting demand, and how we combine that with storage has an effect on the overall building's profile of energy use and consumption over time. So all those, the technologies, the measures, we have them. So that's the great news. The bad news, or rather the challenging component of our work to decarbonize buildings, that there are a number of real world factors impacting building decisions. It is not as simple as just slapping solar on the roof and calling it a day. You have different categories of challenges and factors: the age, the type, and the end use of the building. All of these impact which kind of technologies are going to be suitable, how easy it is going to be to integrate those technologies, what level of efficiency you might already be dealing with, and then of course, behavior and usage patterns. It also affects which code applies, which technologies are going to seamlessly integrate, and are there zoning and permitting issues that might come up? Always. Secondly, ownership, occupancy, and management. It varies, of course. We know that there are owner-occupied buildings, renter-occupied government buildings, business-owned or leased, and there's affordable housing, and then there's buildings that have building managers and HOAs. And all of these elements are really human elements because it affects who pays the mortgage, who pays the bills, who's making the decisions. And then third, and of course, probably most important in most people's minds, are the financials and the energy bills associated with each building. And that affects a lot of things, but certainly adoption of technology. And this is, we all know how buildings are typically paid for. A lot of them are bank owned via mortgages, but there are several out there that are investor owned and they're flip models. The income and credit status of the individuals owning or occupying matters a lot. There may be HOA fees. There are always energy prices at play, and then there are utility bills. And all of these factors are, of course, compounded by the final factor of workforce and technology. Can you find a qualified person to come and install a heat pump in your area? Are they trained? Are they familiar? Do they have an affiliation with a manufacturer that ensures they have one on the truck? And all of these are now emerging as new challenges for us to tackle. And then one more final point as a complicating factor is that there have been a handful of green certification programs out there. You've heard of them, LEED, and there's living buildings, and there's all sorts of other types of certifications that buildings can get to demonstrate that they are green. But the problem is, at this point, they're not all created equal, and many of them do not prioritize or actually achieve decarbonization, in part because they have different levels, but also because they have kind of point-based systems that allow you to kind of do more here and less here. Not a bad thing, but it just goes to show that we can't assume that a building with a certain certification is actually decarbonized. And then the other barriers to keep in mind, of course, higher upfront costs of newer technology is always a challenge. And then there may be additional retrofit expenses. Appliances and equipment may need replacement on an emergency basis. If your furnace goes out in the middle of winter, you're not necessarily going to take or be able to take the time to track down the best contractor and do your research. You're going to need something like the next day. And that affects a lot of upgrades. Not everyone can access financing to pay for upgrades. And financing is more expensive these days with the interest rates being what they are. Stacking order of upgrades. Not everyone cares, to be honest, about the heat pump in the backyard or the solar on the roof, they want a new kitchen. They want new appliances that are just nicer, but maybe aren't as efficient. So, we can't assume that there's a uniform value-based system. There's a patchwork of building codes and code entities and enforcement across the country. And then, as I mentioned, we have growing labor challenges coming out of COVID, and just in general, there's a lot of new training that needs to be done. So now for the policy solutions. So we've done quite a bit of modeling to better understand how we actually achieve a climate neutral or zero carbon building sector by the year 2050. And the good news is that by focusing on new buildings and new appliances, we actually can get about 90% of the emissions reductions we need from the building sector by 2050. Certainly, retrofits and efficiency in existing buildings are important, but buildings and appliances have really slow stock turnover, and they have inherently long lives. So we can't just focus on the retrofits and the existing buildings. We have to keep focusing on the new. And that means that newly sold building equipment must be fully electric by 2035 at the very latest. And the good news is that if we prioritize strong building codes and strong appliance standards, we can avoid stranded fossil fuel assets and the need for more costly retrofits down the road. Also, we are still sitting on huge untapped energy efficiency potential in the United States, and it varies by state, but there are upwards of 741 million megawatt hours that could be saved in all of these states combined just by tapping into kind of more traditional energy efficiency measures. So keeping that in mind, that's always a go-to. But what else? The federal government has a role to play, states have a role to play, local governments have a role to play, and the reality is, and utilities as well, the reality is all of these entities can and should have a role in the overall policy solution toolkit. And I'm keeping an eye on time, so for each of these, I'm going to briefly touch on them and then we can discuss more later. But they fall into, I think I have 8 categories, 4 here and 4 on the other slide. So lead by example. This is, government facilities can do a lot, and we've seen a lot of this from the Biden administration, but there are tons of examples of local governments doing this and state governments as well. Existing buildings, incentive programs are very effective. Revolving loan funds can help finance retrofits on an ongoing basis. Setting building performance standards for like skyscrapers and large buildings can really help. New buildings, really it starts with code. And we have great codes out there, but we also need incentives for developers and perhaps energy efficiency standards at the state level that set the bar higher. For all of these, equity needs to be incorporated, targeting and prioritizing those disadvantaged communities and places and people that can't do this on their own. Targeting programs for affordable housing that optimize both resilience and decarbonization, as well as lower energy bills. And then combining energy upgrades with smart rate design. 3 more here, and then I'll wrap up. Our appliances, as I mentioned, are a huge opportunity. Federal government has appliance and equipment standards office and program. They're doing a lot there already, but state governments can also do this. Rebates are an example of basically paying people to swap out their old fossil fuel appliances and using those funds to fund more energy efficient programs. In the market development category, benchmarking is a really, really important first step to understand where each building is today. Prioritizing grants and technical assistance for contractors, as well as the real estate industry and appraisers and the MLS, all these pieces that factor into decision-making. And then finally, utility regulation. There's a lot to talk about here, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to point out that utilities play an enormous role, very important role in building decarbonization. So it could be integrated in their planning, their rates, their programs, and their incentives. And then with all of these, there need to be complementary workforce, training, education, and credentialing programs. So the IRA is a great tool in our toolbox, and we have a resource available to folks There is so much to cover in the IRA on buildings, and they're listed here. And this report that we put out in November covers each of them in detail. But basically, I'll say this: the IRA is an important first step to unlock more energy efficient buildings, buildings that are safer and more resilient for more people, and that are going to be increasingly electric and just generally kind of better for our public health. So exciting space to be in. If you are curious about all of the details, I encourage you to download this, and or you can listen to our podcast. Senator Martin Heinrich and Representative Kathy Castor join me in February to talk about what's in the IRA, and it's a good listen. So with that, I will pass it over to Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice work, Sarah. You set a high bar as usual. And I should say while I'm at it, thanks for teaming up on the topic of transportation. Sarah's our domestic lead, and I'm leading on our international work. Also wanted to thank Todd and the Center for Environmental Policy for the chance to speak today. Let me start sharing my screen. How's that look?
Very good.
Okay. Moving on. So in the interest of time, let's get right to the outline. I'll try to follow a similar structure to Sarah and talking about the economy-wide context and sources in some detail, solutions, barriers, and then I should say technological solutions, barriers, and policy solutions. With this slide, I wanted to just touch on the transportation element of this. Sarah talked through the how to read the graph before with the size of each box indicating the magnitude of the emissions. And basically, I just wanted to highlight that globally, transportation is around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, a bit more in the United States. About 25% or 35% as a share of carbon dioxide. There's not many non-CO2 gases associated with transportation, unless you're including some of the upstream fuel production or also air conditioning. There's some leakage in vehicles. But let's be efficient here with time to try to get into some of the more subtle policy instruments later. To survey the transportation emission sources, the main ones are road vehicles, trucks and passenger vehicles, buses, also rail, cargo and passenger. In all these modes, there's a cargo and a passenger variant. And so we also have marine shipping and aviation to round out the emissions. And then to take another look at it, the transportation emission breakdown by end uses. This graph shows that in the United States, looking at 2020, I should mention this graph is from the US Energy Policy Simulator, which I understand you all have familiarity with. So that's helpful. And you'll know that the height of the graph is the emissions in million metric tons. And what we're looking at here is a annotation showing that road vehicles are around 88% of the transportation sector more broadly for the United States, and not quite as large a share for the world. Globally, according to IEA data, the road vehicles are around 78% of transportation emissions. So with that, and in the interest of time, we're going to focus on policy for road vehicles from here. And specifically, let's look at the main two options for reaching zero emission or net zero transportation motor vehicle transportation, and those are at the left, battery electric vehicle, familiar to most people. These also can include oftentimes the broader category of zero emission vehicles. Is a label used, for example, in California policy to include both of these options, and plug-in hybrids, including both the gas engine and a battery electric setup powertrain, are also often included in zero emission vehicle definitions, including California. Though those are not such a large share, and they are declining because of some economic problems in terms of it being more costly to produce a car with two powertrains as compared to one. I'll mention that in terms of light duty vehicles, light duty passenger, about 99.99% have been electric vehicles and not hydrogen. In terms of heavy duty vehicles, maybe 90% or more have been battery electric vehicles. So high share have been electric so far. And generally, electric is understood to be the larger solution for the sector for decarbonizing motor vehicles. There's some discussion around, particularly long haul freight trucking or long haul buses as possibly a use where hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, the technology on the right, which I should cover as well, where hydrogen fuel cell might be the optimal solution from a cost perspective and other factors. So on the right, just because it's not as familiar, the hydrogen fuel cell arrangement involves fueling the vehicle with hydrogen, which then serves as an energy source in the fuel cell, onboard fuel cell, which then drives an electric motor in the same way. So really both vehicles are electric. The one option, the battery electric, is primarily battery driven and plugged in order to charge, whereas the hydrogen fuel cell is fueled with hydrogen from a station, and then that's used in a fuel cell on board to create electricity. I did want to touch on an interesting story developing in China with battery swap heavy duty vehicles growing to 48% of sales of ZEVs, zero emission heavy duty trucks, in 2022 out of about 25,000 vehicles sold. We'll look at some numbers later, but I wanted to mention that could be a technological change that will work in battery electric's favor in the future by avoiding the need for more expensive fast charging infrastructure. Wanted to touch on some of the barriers, and then also in laying out policies, we'll connect those to overcoming some of the specific barriers listed here. I spent too many years in grad school, so the academic treatment of market failures and other behavioral and systemic factors and creating path dependency and technology was just too ripe for me to not be able to say in an academic setting. So, of course, there we're talking about how markets don't value pollution automatically, or in most places, or up to a level that's justified by the environmental damage. Other information imperfections, spillover effects, such as increasing returns to scale from fueling infrastructure. But don't get me going. So some of the transportation specific barriers that I wanted to raise and then look at policy solutions to involves higher upfront costs that EVs still have, and the fact that people tend to value, there's a present time bias is one way to put it, that people discount future money holdings or prefer current time holdings. Second specific barrier, I hinted at it around fueling infrastructure and how the current system provides a barrier to new entrants, new technological or corporate or company entrants. Some of the accessibility issues, which Sarah also kindly introduced around how low-income households are more strongly constrained by liquidity or financing obstacles, and then some broader. Well, I summed it up as status quo bias and just a whole range of barriers to the real speed and scale needed to reach net zero pathways. Even though, as I'll argue here that those are some of the most reachable net zero pathways across the economy, my economy-wide ones that you'll see. Here we are looking at, okay, just did a time check, I'm doing okay. So here, the barrier I wanted to consider in more depth is the current upfront cost difference. Electric vehicles are more costly on average to purchase before considering incentives. That's because largely due to battery costs, although battery pack costs have fallen about 90% over the decade from 2010 to 2021. And after a brief hiatus in that downward trajectory because of raw input price pressures, it's already expected to resume, and we're seeing some new affordability thresholds being set. And I'd refer you to a Wall Street Journal, or I can refer you to a Wall Street Journal, which talked about several models having 2 to 5 year paybacks before even accounting for incentives that are available. So increasingly advantageous economics, but still on average more expensive to buy an EV. And so in the interim, in order to maintain momentum in the transition, it makes sense to continue vehicle incentives. And what we're looking at in this slide is an example from China, some of their incentives for battery electric vehicles. You can see how the level of the incentive corresponds to the height of the data point, where it meets the vertical axis, and then we have years or time across the horizontal axis. And what we see is that they've had a quite sophisticated ramping down as different segments have become cost effective, and with increasingly only subsidizing or supporting consumer incentives for higher mileage vehicles. And as we'll see later, China's developed the largest EV market for light and heavy duty vehicles. Here, we're going to talk a bit more about fueling infrastructure. The existing structure was created with little competition, little commensurate competition, you could say, to the extent with the idea that horses weren't really able to perform at the same level as vehicles for certain tasks. So the existing transportation fueling infrastructure developed in a more favorable environment, and now it creates convenience and cost hurdles for technologies that would threaten petroleum fueling dominance. And so this is itself a complex area. And so I've listed a few aspects of the solutions. And one is we're seeing how the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act from last year are seeding national corridors, and the federal government is increasingly stepping up to have more harmonized standards in the industry. We're seeing how California is looking to try to use policies to spur private investment in charging. And last bullet notes a still unresolved challenge regarding the best way to serve existing multifamily housing in urban areas. And that's an issue that if you don't solves it could also add to potential inequities in how electrification rolls out in transportation. Nice segue to another issue of equitable access, and that's based on the fact that lower income people are more income constrained, meaning referring to that in the title of the slide as liquidity. You know, they don't have a lot of free cash to spend on the higher upfront costs that we talked about for ZEVs, zero emission vehicles currently. And also, as Sarah also noted in her talk, there are issues around lack of equitable financing access, and so that's another area for government to engage on. I've always liked the idea of utility programs offering zero down, zero interest loans. And also, while I'm at it, mention that the Department of Energy Loan Program Office has actually earned the federal government a net $4 billion for its balance sheet. So that's a very low cost program, however you cut it. But with this slide, I wanted to just highlight something that we're not really giving probably adequate attention to in our larger work currently at Energy Innovation, though we've worked on it previously, and also not in this talk, which will largely focus on vehicles, is largely focused on vehicles. And so the policy involves better urban design, or as it's called in the caption on the picture on the right, more compact mixed-use development, which is contrasted with a more sprawling mono-use or homogeneous type of development at the left, which ends up requiring people to drive everywhere. And that requires people to buy cars, and which is a more expensive transportation mode. And so a way to improve equity in decarbonization, in transportation decarbonization, is by you know, a lot of work to promote better urban design, investment in public transit, and better walking and biking infrastructure in cities. Let me move on to the next topic here. This is some actual work, research we did at Energy Innovation around inspired by or modeling the effects of a program in California called Clean Cars for All, which offers targeted consumer incentives of up to $9,500. Those would be for people in low income households that are in areas that have been historically burdened by high levels of pollution. Lower income households anywhere are eligible then for a level of support, but not quite as high as the folks that have been directly impacted by industrial pollution, with an idea of social justice for those folks, considering the direct, trying to directly deliver a benefit, considering the harms that have been delivered, or more tying a benefit to the past harms. And so the program's called Clean Cars for All, and what we're seeing in this graph, which shows elements of ownership cost on the left for these different types of, well, for an average gas vehicle, we looked at a sales weighted average of actual vehicles to find this composite here you're looking at for gas and for the EV. These are particularly, I should mention, Clean Cars for All includes support for used vehicles, not only new vehicles. And here we wanted to look at the used vehicle option, and we're looking at model year 2017 weighted average results, which show that there's a small ownership saving, and we're looking at, I'd have to double check if it was a 5 or 6 year ownership period. We do a discounting of future fuel savings and maintenance savings as well in this accounting. You can see on the left, maintenance costs are in yellow or golden color, and fuel costs are in green. And those are where the big savings are for EVs. We also include some charger costs, but all in the EV, even before incentives, is saving around $1,000, 4% or so of the average apples to apples comparison of gas to EVs. And when you add in the Clean Cars for All incentives, it's an almost 40% reduction in transportation costs for those households. So that was exciting to find out. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next few minutes because I'm coming to the end of my time. I'm going to go through a few more examples of a few more examples of the way that the vehicle policy is implemented. So these are requirements around new vehicles, and here we see what the European Union is doing. As at the federal level in the US, their main instrument of choice is a tailpipe standard. There's an industry average set in the United States, and then they can trade compliance credits to allow for some flexibility. And so what we're looking at here is the average carbon dioxide emission per kilometer traveled in different years. The blue line is the historical level. And then we see these stepping down. The step down in the right shows plans for reductions in the allowed emissions of carbon dioxide. And then the dashed elements of the step down showed proposal to take the tailpipe standard to zero allowable emissions in 2035, which is how the European Union plans to meet their 100% zero emission vehicle pledge by 2035. Here, breezing through this is California's Advanced Clean Trucks. Again, what we're looking at is the values we're looking at are the percent of ZEVs in new sales for the particular class. So previously we were looking at passenger vehicles, and now we're looking at trucks and broken out by different classes. Here we're looking at China's dual credit policy, and it was modeled off of California's zero emission vehicle policy example. And you can see, let me just highlight one factor, one fact or facet here. That's the 18% credit target for the year 2023, because later on we're going to see that China has already pretty far exceeded that level. Now, this is some great work that Sarah and colleagues have done. And so I was going to ask her to briefly talk us through what this is showing. This shows the combined effect of state and federal policies, what we expect those to mean for electric vehicle or ZEV adoption in light duty and heavy duty segments. So Sarah, do you want to briefly tell us about that?
Yeah.
We're running a little short on time.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just
All right.
going to say, I'm cognizant of time, happy to chat about it and or encourage folks to take a look at the report. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and also I'll just put a word in for Sarah's 2035 report on transportation. Really was a landmark step forward on pushing for 100% ZEVs in the US by 2035. And if we want, I've got some updates and estimates for 2023 on car sales showing 33% estimated EV car sales in China this year. Remember, the compliance level required was 18%. And in heavy duty trucks, we're seeing estimating that those will rise to 7% this year in China, up from 3.5%. So yeah, we can talk a little bit more about net zero pathways for transportation in the IEA's net zero 2030, IEA's net zero by 2050 work, if that's of interest in the discussion. But let me tie it up there, and thanks again to everyone, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, both of you, for excellent presentations. And I'm sorry, it looks like we could definitely go on for a long time. And I hope we get that chance. For now, let me just turn it over to David Levy, who is the Director of Planning and Zoning for the town of Vienna, Virginia, who's going to bring in a lot of comments, I think, related, and also sort of bringing a lot of the issues discussed generally into sort of into practice, and how we have to deal with these things at the local level as well. And it's a great pleasure to introduce David, and thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Great presentation, Sarah and Chris. For those who know the planning world, at least as it's done in the US, so always start with a joke, right? My daughters, who are now 20 and 24, as you know, as they get to a certain age, you might get a lecture at home, a lecture or two. And my wife and I, at one point, were lectured that we need to be working on climate. Everybody needs to be working on climate. And they were shocked when I told them that's actually what I do every day, because they thought I was a planner. And I worked for local governments. So that was a nice conversation. I've been in Vienna, Virginia since May of last year, but I've worked in many different settings, US local governments, including my native Baltimore, internationally in Ecuador, Native American reservations, and as a consultant to various governments. Now, I'm a planner. See, I even have the blazer with no tie. But for much of my career, I defined my purpose related to community development, revitalization, involving the health, vibrancy, and sustainability of communities with the many definitions of sustainability. It wasn't climate. In fact, in the early part of my career, in the early 90s, wasn't really even part of the conversation. I actually worked from my native Baltimore for a total of 6 years. Thinking about the drop in population, it dropped over 300,000 from close to 1 million down to 600,000, over a 40-year period. And that was happening all over these Rust Belt cities. And so the desire to redevelop and bring back cities had a whole sustainability from, as an entity, as a municipality, as a community set of goals. And the environmental context entered, not from a broader context, because the connection between land use, vehicle miles traveled, and emissions that Chris referenced was just emerging in a way that was relatable to land use planning. The 1990s saw the rise of both kind of two things running in parallel: the concept of brownfields redevelopment and infill development, and the broader discussion of sustainability. Brownfields was a marriage of convenience in a way between the property owners who were concerned about liability and those who cared about community redevelopment. So there was kind of a set of tools that were built, stimulated at the federal level, with seed grants, and the studies of that also ran in parallel with the development of EPA's Smart Growth Office. That office funded, some of you know some of these people, Harriet Tregoning, Jeff Anderson, Will Schroer, who ended up working with me at a consulting firm at Hagler Bailly, and then ICF. And they did some of the very early studies. Chris referenced that their organization could do a little more work on understanding the relationship between land use and emissions and vehicle miles traveled. Some of the very early work was done through EPA grants. For those who want to kind of see there at the beginning, the study of Atlantic Station was a brownfields, a contaminated former industrial area in Atlanta. And it was used as a model. So you say, okay, what if we did an infill development project here, and if that happened here instead of in a suburban or an ex-urban way, um, what would be the reduction in vehicle miles traveled because people had to drive shorter distances. You plugged it into your regional transportation model, which produced the amount of vehicle miles traveled, and then you could mechanistically produce what the emissions are. And that was sort of the first early attempts to quantify those things, but that was early in the game. There has been a significant advances in that thinking. All metropolitan planning organizations, such as Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and all over the country, attempt to assess how they're doing relative to clean air standards and emissions related to. In fact, they're on the hook to report in exchange for their federal funds on their progress or lack thereof. It was great groundbreaking work, and it laid the groundwork for planning departments to change their approach to land use at the local level. So to be clear, cities were already working on infill and densification in many parts, in many parts of the jurisdictions. If you remember, a city is not just one thing. A city is an office area, it's an industrial area, it's multifamily housing, it's single family detached housing. But cities were already working on redensification if they had lost density, or densification if it hadn't there before. So these studies just provided a new set of justifications for what kind of center cities were already trying to do. What it really helped was to spur the suburbs to think differently about themselves. And that matches what Chris's image showed, the single family detached neighborhoods relative to the mixed use infill areas. Really beginning in the late 90s and early 2000s and earlier in many places, mixed use zoning was embraced along commercial corridors that had been zoned for commercial land alone. For those who are not too aware of zoning and planning practice over the many decades, the practice for many decades was single-use zoning. You do housing here, you do industry here, you do commercial there, and then that's set up very well for a car community. When the cars came along, you live here, you drive there, you drive there. But the embrace of mixed-use nodes and areas within zoning facilitated meeting a market that was there to be filled. There were, if you think about who wants to live in multifamily housing that's built on top of retail, there are plenty of households that are not, two parents and 2 or 3 kids who are going to tend to want to be more in a single family detached house. Many single households, couples, 3 people, retirees, many people who are willing, I don't want the yard, I don't do. So it's kind of low hanging fruit. Who really would like to live in that setting? But what was and is the greatest challenge remains the single family detached zoning areas. The infill centers, many of the centers, just to give you the sense of the scope of it, many of you probably know this, just take Washington, D.C. Its population dropped from over 900,000 to about 600,000 from 1970 to the 1990s. It's now moving up again towards over 700,000 now at the last census. But what's the region's population? It's about 5.5 million. So even if DC gets all gangbusters, redensifies, tops 1 million, it's still not going to even be 20% of the total regional population. And so many of the surrounding areas are single family detached zoning. You might find a jurisdiction in a suburban area that 70% of the privately owned land is single family detached zoning. So Todd asked me to present the kinds of obstacles you face, and I think many of you know this. The community planning conversations about the single family detached zoning are very fraught. People, I have tended sometimes in settings such as this of asking, I'll tell you how fraught they are. I have spoken at transit-oriented development conferences at planning conferences that are focused on mixed use and density, and the audience are all ideologues who believe in it. And I asked that crowd, what percentage of the people here live in single family detached houses? And it's 80% of that crowd. So imagine the folks who don't even believe in it. So people really like this setting to live in. And so it tends to be a very uphill battle, if you're going to fight that battle at all, to kind of change a very, a trajectory that has a lot of inertia and momentum behind it. So those are some of the real challenges to, so just to kind of knit it all together, in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled, people must have the services and employment in proximity to them in such a way that they can, or the transportation network and resources proximate to them, that they don't need to use an automobile. In order to do that, you've got to reduce transportation travel time. So from in the DC metropolitan area, almost anybody can, large percentage of the people could walk to a bus stop that would take them to a metro station that would get them to their work. That's going to take 2 or 3 times longer than if they get their car and drive to work. And so, because people frequently are limited in their time, if they have kids, they have a million things they're trying to do, they're not going to make that option, because the cost of travel, not necessarily from a money side, but from a time side, just rules it out. So unless you're really at the metro station and your work is on another metro station or within a pretty quick walk, people tend not to choose that option if they're in the suburbs. So there's a physical plant issue. You might read that all around the country there's a discussion about blowing up the single family detached zoning, and there are some cities that have taken on that challenge. They are huge controversies. California has discussed it at the state level and has walked down the path of requiring that cities and towns open up their areas. But them's the things that fighting back come from. Liberal California had Proposition 13 long ago in response to rising taxes, and just watch this one. Former President Trump tried to win re-election on this very topic. It didn't work for him, but he talked about that the liberals are trying to ruin your suburbs. So this is actually a fraught issue that's quite tricky. I would say that the organization of Sarah and Chris, it would be wonderful to get additional research in this area to really uncover how important for greenhouse gas emissions land use change is as a percentage of the total. That is, if you can get technology adoption, would that cover most of the issue in that regard? It might not answer some of the community building issues of density and proximity to each other and neighbors, but it would be nice to see whether the technology side can answer most of the issue, because I've been a few decades into this, and the single family detached housing land use pattern is quite a resilient pattern in the American culture. So let me talk just a little bit of a response to some of the presentations as a discussant. Sarah mentioned about the building codes. I worked in Rockville, Maryland, where a green building code was adopted. It wasn't exactly LEED, but as Sarah said, there are requirements and incentives for new buildings to adopt the new technologies that will reduce emissions. But as Sarah said, the existing stock remains a great challenge, and no incentive structure has been set up, at least within that jurisdiction, to start to move the needle of the existing stock. Other things that can be done that relates to both your presentations, requiring electric charging stations during private development of a certain scale. That's happening in many places. Providing electric charging stations on public land. Again, Rockville experimented with that. It's still there at one of the community centers. So we've got some parking spaces in a parking lot. Let's put some electric charging stations there. I think parklands are a great place to do it. People are going to park and sit there for an hour. They can come back and their vehicles are charged. So those are great opportunity areas. I would encourage you to promote those things with local governments. I'm gonna stop there for now. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you have during the discussion. So just the final call. There is great movement towards embracing transit-oriented development and mixed-use development in areas that used to be commercially zoned. Many of them, if not most of them around the country, have already been rezoned to permit mixed-use development so that higher density housing can happen where transit is more likely to be serving the area. That's progress. The whole town center movement came related to that, especially near high capacity transit. At the margin, some small movement has been made in some few jurisdictions to mix up land uses in traditionally single-family detached areas, but it's quite a resilient land use that communities fight to retain, and I'm not sure that I project that that's going to change anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, I guess, conveying that where the rubber meets the road in the suburbs, the soccer moms and dads and others may have some resistance to some of the changes that are afoot, and for raising the question for the presenters regarding the issue of technology adoption and how much of the problem this would cover and how much would still need to be resolved by changing land use mixes in especially some of the suburban areas that you spoke of. And I hope I'm sort of phrasing that as a start to the questions. And if I'm doing that justice, I'll take a few from the audience. If David, if you'd like to rephrase it.
Yeah, I'd like to do one. So for a couple of years, I served as the chair of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Planning Directors Technical Advisory Committee, PDTAC, whatever it is. And during that time, COG hired ICF to do a study of what sectors are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and what are the tools that are likeliest to help the Metropolitan Washington region get closer to compliance with its own goals. Because all these MPOs are not reaching what their goals are. So COG said, all right, and the board, which is the jurisdictional head, so it's great, said, all right, what can we do? From the land use side, and all the things that Sarah and Chris laid out, their chart were kind of laid out, but this was like 5-6 years ago, so your data is more up to date, certainly, especially at the international level. But transportation was big, buildings were big, energy, water movement was big, and the electricity that it takes to move water. But then there was also the land use side as it relates to transportation. the study, and I'm trying to dig up the, the final one. I was hoping to speak from it a little bit today. It asked every participating jurisdiction. So these MPOs are local governments getting together to report on their performance on the Clean Air Act, and then they do other kind of regional things together. And the report asked each jurisdiction, okay, what's your zoning now? What are your activity centers? Where are you trying to direct density? What realistically do you think you can increase in your provision of density, either at the kind of baseline level, and then if you were really aspirational, if you were really pushing it, what could you do? So it left it in the hands of the planning folks. And it didn't move the needle very much, I have to say.
right.
But that's the kind of stuff it would be great to have folks like Chris and Sarah kind of teasing out relative to technology. So anyway.
All right, thank you. Let me take a few more questions. We'll have a round of questions and answers, and then I think we may have to break after that. Because these have been all very information-packed presentations. So let me get right to the Q&A by adding to the one that David just formulated. And by the way, David, if you want to answer some of the questions, please, audience, feel free to direct them to him as well. I guess my question may be for Chris. You spoke of 88% of the emissions in the transportation sector in the U.S. being caused by sort of road vehicles, and I guess the hardest parts of the sector to deal with have been air transportation and shipping. And I wonder if you could just talk about why those are viewed as being so difficult, understanding that they're a much smaller part of the problem, but nonetheless, they seem to be parts of the problem that are going to be perhaps more difficult to solve. All right, and let me just give a few more questions from the audience before we proceed to give you guys a chance to answer them. Question emerges about whether it's time for the US to get a maglev system as China and Japan, magnetic levitation train system. And furthermore, the questioner asks, why can't we recycle some of the subway trains? Apparently, according to the questioner, are dumped into the ocean. Why aren't we encouraging the use of some older train cars in perhaps new subway systems? I think is what is getting at. All right, let me go on to another question, which refers to the housing sector, which was one about residential versus commercial. How much of the problem of emissions are constituted by each of these subsectors? And the questioner raised also the issue of renters who are in say buildings where landlords don't have much incentive to make changes. In other words, I guess it's the sort of the bias against change, given the costliness of changing to new forms of utilities, for example. Another question is about possible banning of new fossil fuel gas stations in order to support EVs. And I guess the last one is specifically for David. Are there policies to help mitigate some of the pushback against changing of zoning laws? That is, say, for example, incentives for homeowners or communities or other regulatory measures that you can think of that might help reduce the objections to, sort of more concentrated zoning in urban areas. I think we'll leave it at that for now. Let's see. I mean, you want to just go in the order of the speakers? Would that work? All right. Sarah, would you start us off?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And I did provide in the Q&A box a couple of links. It's not all-inclusive set of resources to respond to the renter question, but there are a lot of resources out there. And I recognize, I've been a renter, also been a landlord. I know that the dynamic exists and that it's not easy. I will say that there are a lot of relatively low cost and what I would call sort of more replaceable technologies that you can adopt as a renter, like even an induction cooktop that's maybe a two-top that can just sit on your counter can replace your or substitute your gas stove usage in most cases. LED lights are light bulbs rather are obviously abundantly available. So I would say go for the low-hanging fruit wherever you can, and don't assume just because you are a renter that none of these options are on your table. And have a conversation with your landlord. It's, probably a lot of people avoid having that conversation out of sensitivity, but I think it is a-okay to say, hey, I'm concerned about either my public health or I'd like to do something more about climate where I live. What are you willing to do? And, start the dialogue. On the second part of that question was kind of the likelihood of residential versus commercial spaces moving. And I don't like to speculate on likelihood because we need to do it all. So it's not so much about, is this likely? I think it's more about which tools in the toolbox do we already have and which ones do we need more of? I didn't get to go into detail about the Inflation Reduction Act, but we have now a huge toolbox for both sectors, residential and commercial alike, that I'm very convinced will shift the dynamic there. And then the other piece there, and then I'll wrap it up, is that the commercial code adoption is actually typically less controversial than residential code adoption, and don't have time to go into the reasons for that, but there's a lot we can do with commercial code, and I'm convinced that there's more ripe opportunities there for states to explore in the near term. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And just as we go to Chris, I also wonder if you might post in the chat some links. I know Energy Innovation has really good modeling that is publicly available. And I think we've discussed this before in this series, but I just wanted to remind people, if you were willing to perhaps post a link, we would really appreciate it. I perhaps should have posted it earlier, but to thank you so much and to move to Chris.
That's a great segue, because I just wanted to mention that we have what you might call VMT management or travel demand management in the model. It's one of the levers under transportation. And so you can actually look at a breakout of vehicle standards, incentives, and smart growth or sustainable freight policies as well. I should say, it's a national model, and those are policies that are local. So it's not a sophisticated representation of all the different pathways that add up to changes in VMT control. But I would say we're in complete agreement. It's a really important area, climate solution with probably the most co-benefits, in my opinion, when you consider active transportation and other quality of life improvements. And we've worked with Peter Kalkorp in both California and China, one of the original progenitors of transit-oriented development. And I have to say, it's a lot easier in China, where they're developing new cities where they're urbanizing rapidly, than in the US, where the street patterns are more set. Why so hard to solve some of these other aviation and marine modes? I guess I would summarize it as an issue around energy density of batteries currently, which is improving, but in terms of the size of the battery you'd need for a long haul flight, et cetera, you start to lose space, which is why, for example, that might be an area where hydrogen or another biofuels might be the solution that would come in for aviation. Although there are short haul electric aviation options, and I think California is conceptually looking at perhaps a requirement around short haul flights being zero emission. Recycling, I'm not sure about rail cars, but I do know there is a push to have more recycling of battery materials. And I'm not, I understand on a personal level where the question comes from about how problematic new gas station investments are. There's right near me, I live in a suburban area, and right near me there's like a corner with 4 gas stations already, and they're putting in a new one. And so I have that, but that's not something we've worked on per se.
Great, thank you. David?
Sure. Yeah. And Neil, thanks for the question. I appreciate that. It was asked, are there policies that might help mitigate some of the pushback? I would say it a little differently. I think there are processes and procedures for working with communities. So if it's a policy for how to work with people, maybe that's it. So, kind of the negative, prospect that I presented is shouldn't entirely be viewed negatively. I'll come back to the job that I had right before I came here into Vienna, which was in Rockville. We did an update to our overall comprehensive plan. And we were completely committed to community input. We did so many public meetings, neighborhood by neighborhood, citywide. And I guess what I would say that there are only a few people out there who would be willing to experience rezoning in their single family neighborhood because they've heard about the challenges of climate change. That's not that's not something that's going to move the needle for other than maybe 2 or 3% of the people sitting there. It's going to be for other reasons. It's going to be for because housing is too expensive. It's because my kid can't afford to live in this jurisdiction anymore. It's because in order for me to buy this house, which is so darn expensive, I really need to have an ADU, accessory dwelling unit, or a second unit that'll help me to pay the mortgage on this. And then you start into the conversation about sustainability at a broader level and who can actually live in the community. And then the climate advantages can be part of that conversation, but I haven't seen a case where that was the convincing factor for the change to zoning. So it has to be part, think globally, act locally. Well, you can think globally, but you also have to think locally. You have to empathize, sympathize, work with people. So I would say in the updated comprehensive plan, a vision for a few of the neighborhoods of the town actually did call for some diverse housing in what has been single family detached areas. It wasn't a broad sweep. It was more at the edges of the neighborhoods, but there are areas for we GIS aficionados, that are colored for more mixed use housing on the edges of certain neighborhoods where they had been purely single family. So progress. Will it change the world? No, it doesn't change the world. But interestingly, a particular politician who was not at all for any of that stuff was absolutely convinced that we planners had kind of snuck it into the plan without consulting with the community. And she went and talked with them, the community leaders and other folks, and did a walk around with them. And they immediately called me and said, can you believe this? She thinks you didn't talk to us. So, so the politicians are frequently in a mode that reflects some of their community and a traditional view of what it is. So again, kind of the short answer to Neil's question is, it has to be engagement. If you try it top down, you will get blown out of the water. That has to be a broader community conversation about community needs and local needs in the US. That's our context here, rather than a lecture about climate.
All right, thanks a lot. And I guess I guess we don't want to have any more lectures about climate. And I
Oh,
guess,
here you can do that, just not. in here.
but I mean to thank you very much, all three of you, to highlight again that energyinnovation.org is a site for a lot of models and reports relating to the sectoral approach. To thank all three of the speakers very much, and to just convey to you that our next webinar will be on April 11th, Tuesday, on the sectoral approach to climate mitigation. Land use and agriculture will be the subjects on that day. So again, I mean, I just really appreciate very much the contributions today in this excellent dialogue. And indeed, we do have to change the world, and we don't have a huge amount of time. And so all hands on deck, and Energy Innovation and the town of Vienna are certainly part of the hands, as is the Center for Environmental Policy. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. Thanks a lot.